Their knowledge and faith are useless. We have no need for them. This was the purported observation of the late Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb when noting the persistence of Europeans at coastal enclaves seeking permission to trade in India. To the Mughal Emperor, England was an insignificant island far away, not even worth noting. King Charles of England would have been seen as a minor prince at best. Of course, to either an Indian or European observer, it was inconceivable to think in 1700 that this empire, the wealthiest in the world by any measure, would soon fall into a form of decay and decline. It was equally inconceivable to imagine that a small, tiny, foggy island off the northwestern coast of Europe would come to rule as heirs of the Mughals, transforming India into the single most valuable colony for any empire in history. Yet this is largely what happened. The Mughal Empire, which lasted from 1526 until as late as 1858, in theory, was certainly known for its grandeur, wealth, and high cultural achievements. Indeed, it helped create what many historians would consider a modern Indian culture and provided a crucial template for the early British colonial state. Today, we're going to examine the multiple and interconnected dynamics of the late Mughal Empire in the 1700s, and we'll examine how broader changes in Indian politics, society, and economics, which were themselves byproducts of Mughal expansion, laid the foundation for foreign conquest after the 1750s. So we're going to look at the Mughal Empire's history briefly in order to understand the more important broader dynamics of pre-colonial India. Specifically, we're going to examine 5 major themes today, which help us put ourselves in the shoes of the British and the Indians in the 1700s. First, we're going to examine how the Mughals, as Muslims, ruled over and administered a largely Hindu population, and how this created a genuine Indo-Islamic culture and administration. Secondly, we'll look at how deep the Mughal Empire's taxation and revenue machinery went into the Indian countryside. For the single greatest source of wealth for the Mughals, like the British later, was the wealth from India's fields and plains. Thirdly, we're going to analyze the religious policies of the Mughals and see how managing religious difference became stitched into the fabric of their own administrative culture. Fourthly, we're going to examine the state of society and religion in 18th century India. And lastly, we're going to examine the 18th century process of regionalization. This is one of the most crucial developments to understand how the East India Company itself, a small, numerically and uninformed power, would eventually take over most of the Mughal Empire. When we step back, the broader lesson from today's lecture is for us to understand how the Mughal Empire ruled, what it had achieved by the early 1700s, and what the larger dynamics of the 18th century were that provided the preconditions for British takeover. For many of the dynamics of 18th century India were the very ones dealt with by British traders, mercenaries, and, eventually, aspiring imperial visionaries. Now, let's start with an overview of the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire was founded in 1526. At the Battle of Panipat outside of Delhi, the warrior Babur, a descendant of Tamerlane and Genghis Khan, smashed the last remaining Muslim ruler of Delhi, Ibrahim Lodi. Babur's grandson, the famed Emperor Akbar, did much to put the empire on a firm footing. So much so that by the 1600s, the Mughal Empire had effectively become a truly Indian empire. Now, it must be remembered that the Mughal Empire was a contemporary of the other great landed Muslim empires of the time, the Safavid Empire of Persia and the Ottoman Empire of the Middle East. It would be fair to say, though, that they easily dwarfed their European counterparts in terms of wealth, prestige, and cultural achievements. Between them, they ruled between Belgrade and Bangladesh, a large part of the Eurasian landmass. But the Mughal Empire was the largest all-India empire thus far, and it was the wealthiest empire in the world by 1700. Now, how did this come to be? What did they do differently from the Spanish, the Ottomans, or the Ming dynasty of China? Let's now proceed to examine how the Mughals administered India. The Mughals administered and maintained their empire in India in 3 ways. First, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the Mughal Empire was one large armed military camp. Officers and soldiers were the most numerous and important class of people in the empire. Indeed, the name of the language, Urdu, itself is a reflection of this. Coming from the Turkish, Urdu means camp, and slightly refers to the variant of North Indian dialects spoken in the Mughal barracks, infused with Persian and Arabic words. Second, the Mughals established a sophisticated administrative and bureaucratic system. It was the single most developed, layered, and complex agrarian taxation system in the world, other than possibly China. and it awed the British when they assumed the mantle of the Mughals. Thirdly, the Mughals' official and unofficial policies of religious tolerance gave their empire symbolic legitimacy that lasted until the mid-19th century. For in a land of such mind-boggling diversity as India, this was perhaps one of the single greatest contributors to Mughal legitimacy and endurance. Now, let's start with the reality of armed force. The Mughals were conquerors of India. That can't be denied. And as a consequence, their armed forces and military power were afforded great prominence in the affairs of the court. Upwards of 3/4 of the empire's revenue went to paying military officers. The Mughals were good at raising armies, feeding them, and using them to expand borders. They were a gunpowder empire. But their mainstay was swift, mobile cavalry. And since horses have never been native to India, the Mughals after the 1500s imported a steady stream of horses from Central Asia, Persia, and Arabia. All of this combined, the Mughals were a military force on par with China, the Persians, Europeans, and the Ottomans. Indeed, the posture of military force, tactics, and organization would eventually be adopted by various successor and regional states in 18th century India. Now, let's move away from conquest and force and proceed to examine the more gentlemanly ways of ruling, through paper and bureaucratic administration. The Mughal Empire was an Indo-Islamic empire and ruled India with a sophisticated administrative and governing machinery. It allowed significant scope for Hindus to become part of its administration. Let's see precisely how this system became Indo-Islamic. Now, before the Mughals, Muslim sultans never fully developed administrative or political roots. But the Mughals recognized this shortcoming and set out to address it in ways that would set the standard for later emperors, and indeed to some degree for the British, for the next 400 years. Now, one question you probably have right now is, well, weren't the Mughals, as Muslims, a minority? And that's a great question. And the answer is yes. They were a minority. They conquered India through force. But the Mughals could have never ruled India effectively in the long term without employing a portion of Indians and Hindus and others into the administrative machinery. This was seen in the way the administration functioned. The empire had imperial officers known as mansabdars. They were the equivalent of European military aristocracies, and they held land grants from which they raised soldiers, maintained family honor, and served the emperor. They were also appointed regional governors known as subhadars, coming from the term subha, or province, and dar, meaning a holder of. Then we can move to the fabric of local administration. Zamindars were the equivalent of large landowners and served in a way as intermediaries between the empire and the cultivators of India's vast agrarian wealth. Zamindars were kind of like lords in Europe, who were responsible often enough for remitting taxes to the emperor. On the whole, the Mughals worked through large local elites and power brokers, rather than replace them or force them to convert to Islam. It was far more practical for them that way. But now let's turn to another aspect of administration. One of the most pressing matters in a country with such staggering linguistic diversity as India is the question of language and how political authority communicates with subjects. The Mughals adopted Persian as the language of the court. For in the lands east of Baghdad, Islam might have been the language of God, but Persian, or Farsi, was the language of rule. The rise of Mughal imperial power made Persian the language of authority, and it was even adopted by Hindu and Sikh regional rulers later on. Now this is really significant, for Persian would remain the language of government, authority, and legitimacy in India for 3 generations into British colonial rule. Now you might be asking yourselves, why were the Mughals attracted to India? Isn't it hotter than Central Asia? What made them stay? And that's another great question. The answer is wealth. What drove the British to India's shores also drove the Mughals to enter the subcontinent through the Hindu Kush mountain range. The main aim of the Mughals' administrative machinery, aside from ruling, was to collect and harness the vast wealth of India's agriculture, or what Sir William Hunter called, quote, the one great customary source of fiscal wealth in India. Indeed, the wealth of India for rulers was mind-blowing. For such an ancient civilization, rulers had regularly concentrated and held wealth. Now, the Mughals were heirs to that tradition, and boy did they extract wealth. And they used it to build an empire that lasted for nearly 3 centuries. One of the reasons the agrarian wealth of India was so great had to do with geography and weather. South Asia, for example, has more often than not been blessed by the vagaries of the monsoon season. In some parts of India, 2 to 3 annual harvests are possible. I mean, distribution aside, historically, India has produced enough food to feed its own people. What the Mughals did was to create a more regularized system of taxation and, by extension, general administration and governance. For matters of land ownership, law, and policy, in some way revolved back around the fiscal appetite of the empire. After all, the Mughals needed to pay soldiers, officers, governors, tax collectors, support the clerics, and to build big monuments like the Taj Mahal so people in India and later would remember them. By 1700, the Mughal taxation machine produced hundreds of thousands of volumes, papers, reports, assessments, and accounts of crops, assessment, default, you name it. It was an empire awash with paper, or what one famous Indian historian called a paper empire, or a Kagaz Raj. Pen and paper enabled the Mughals to enforce authority and, in a way, to legitimize it. And since the Mughals were Muslim and spoke Persian at court, most revenue terms in India, even today, are largely of Persian and or Arabic origin, such as Qabul for agreement, Jama for assessment, and Kistebandi for installment of tax agreements. Now, did the Mughals hold all of these posts across government? Well, the answer is that by 1700, most of the middle and lower rungs of Mughal administration, between Punjab, Madras, and Bengal, were largely held by Hindus. Hindu pensmen and clerical castes in North India, called Kayasthas, learned Persian and established traditions of literacy and service that actually lasted deep into the British period. I mean, they were outwardly Hindu, but they spoke Persian, recited Quranic injunctions at official meetings, and conformed largely to Islamic etiquette. Some even became major officials in places such as Bengal, Awadh, and the Mughal court itself in Delhi. And this trend became so marked that one 18th century Muslim cleric complained, quote, "All of India's accountants and clerks are Hindus. They control the country's wealth." Now, the Mughals ruled all of India, but how much did the average person's life change? Were they affected? Well, the truth is, not that much. Indian society, as we discussed previously, has historically been fairly self-policing and regulating. Mughal authority was only really noticeable at the upper levels of politics and regional life, or when regiments of troops passed through. The average quintessential Indian village, with its more traditional Hinduism, Brahmin officiators, and customs and rituals, would have seen very little change. But of course, cultivators and farmers felt the impact of Mughal taxation demands. But as rulers, unlike the British later, the Mughals were tempered by a moderation and a general regard for the well-being of India's cultivators. The British, as we'll see later on, had much less concern for these groups. Thus, in a way, the Mughal Empire didn't really penetrate as deep into the Indian countryside as the British would later. Large swaths of rural village society remained untouched and outside the firm reach of the Mughals. The world of the court was miles away, literally and figuratively, from the massed countryside, or the Mufassal. Now that we've covered the administrative machinery of the Mughal Empire, let's turn to the Mughals' broader religious policies and the state of society. These are all important to understand the context in which British rule emerged in the 18th century. Now, if we think for a moment, what was the main predicament facing the Mughals as Muslim rulers of India? Well, you got it. Most of the Mughal subjects were not Muslim. They were Hindu, Jain, or Buddhist. The Mughals, though, were largely accommodative and managing of India's religious traditions and diversity. Because like in most global pre-modern empires, religious identity was rarely displayed in communal and doctrinal terms. The Mughal emperors set a standard of religious mysticism and accommodation, which allowed Hindus, Jains, and to a degree, Sikhs, to participate. Most Mughal emperors, save perhaps Aurangzeb, who ruled until 1707, were devotees of the more mystical traditions of Islam, known as Sufism. Sufism had a strong following among both Indian Muslims and Hindus. Many of the very Hindu clerks and pensmen I mentioned earlier regularly visited Sufi shrines and rubbed shoulders with Indian Muslims in shared religious and spiritual experiences. Combined with what was an armed camp and a sophisticated administrative system, the Mughals' syncretic, accommodative religious patterns of governance, this all enabled them to rule, govern, and tax effectively. So let's stop for a moment and let's ask ourselves another important question. It's about identity. What kind of empire was the Mughal Empire? Wasn't it an Islamic empire? Was it an Indian one? Well, the answer is largely both. The Mughals created a truly Indo-Islamic empire and culture. It was certainly an empire that was Muslim, in the sense it was ruled by Muslims. The culture of Islam was inescapable at court, and indeed in politics and administration. Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains had no choice but to defer to many of these prerogatives of religion. But at the same time, it was also profoundly Indian. Hindus became major stakeholders in the court. The binding of Hindu pensmen to the cultural and administrative machinery of the empire meant that it was inevitably equally Indian. Now that we've covered the broader administrative and cultural aspects of the Mughal Empire, let's move a bit forward to examine the state of Indian society in the 18th century. For understanding the dynamics of 18th century India is indispensable for understanding the rise of British power. Indian society in the 1700s was the inheritor of a great and awe-inspiring Indo-Islamic culture. It was vibrant, sophisticated, and syncretic. In terms of religion, the spiritual traditions of Jainism, Hinduism, and Islam received newfound patronage from various regional and local rulers. Marvelous tombs and temples were built in places such as Jaipur, Lucknow, and Hyderabad. Now, you might be wondering whether there was any religious conflict in pre-colonial India. I mean, we think of India and Pakistan as rivals today. But in fact, historians have demonstrated that there was very little explicit Hindu-Muslim religious rivalry in 18th century India. Sure, the policies of Emperor Aurangzeb could reflect a religious or communal perspective. But on the whole, syncretism and accommodation largely prevailed over conflict and rivalry. For example, many Hindus, particularly these Kayasta pensmen, had learned Persian and willingly practiced Islamic etiquette. Though less so, some Sufi Muslims attended Hindu devotional ceremonies and translated the great Hindu epics, such as the Ramayana. When religious violence did break out, it was usually shaped by economic, military, and political motives. It was rarely purely religious. For example, there were many Muslims in the Sikh armies of the Punjab, and Hindu merchants who would later play crucial roles in vaulting the East India Company to power, came to bankroll many regional kingdoms ruled by Muslims, such as those in Bengal and Awadh. But on the whole, this is not to suggest that pre-colonial India was all hold our hands and let's be lovey-dovey. Religion could show its nasty face as a political force, but it was very rare. And India was a society that was largely defined by heterogeneity, syncretism, and diversity in the 18th century. It was certainly not, as the British would later claim to support their rule, a period of Muslim oppression and Hindu subjection. Let's now move on to discussing a crucial political dynamic of 18th century India. This flourishing and vibrant state of society was also made possible by what historians have called the regionalization of the Mughal Empire. On the surface, the Mughal Empire may have looked wealthy and powerful to a visitor. But beneath the surface, significant changes were taking place in regional politics, which would ultimately set the stage for either an Indian regional power or an external power to seize advantage and establish their dominance as heirs to the Mughals. The death of the Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707 is when this really starts to transpire. His military campaigns into the south, expanding the empire, covered nearly all of India. Yet with this expansion came major problems in the long term. Now, what happens to government balance books when you're continually fighting wars? Well, you tend to run in the red, and you need to pay off your debts. And this is exactly what Aurangzeb left to his successors. In order to pay off these debts and fund further military campaigns and reward military generals for their service, the Mughals had to tax the territories they had conquered. Now, what this meant is that they had to rely upon local leaders, headmen, and village chieftains and landlords. The Mughals gave them titles and, importantly, largely let them run their own affairs, so long as they remitted the taxes. Now, of course, we can think about this. Wasn't this dangerous to central imperial authority? Well, yes. I mean, in theory, it gave greater power to these newly enabled provinces. And this is precisely what started to transpire. Upstart regional governors with titles started to very slowly subvert imperial authority from Delhi. And this happened in a few ways. One, large local landowners, zamindars, who were responsible for remitting tribute and revenue to the Mughal emperor, started to resist these sort of overtures. Many resisted imperial authority across North India in the 18th century. Hindu princes, Maharajas, acknowledged Mughal authority, but they were largely left to manage their own local affairs. During the 18th century, many resisted Mughal revenue demands and were in isolated locales. For example, many Rajput warrior kingdoms in western India and the Thar Desert had forts, which made them, frankly, impenetrable. Then there were the provincial governors, or subadars. Appointed by the Mughal emperor to provinces such as Awadh, Bengal, and Hyderabad, they had no local connections to their provinces. But they also feared no redress from Delhi, knowing that the court needed them to raise the revenue. And they started to act autonomously. So what we have going on here was not really the breaking up or the decline of the Mughal Empire. Rather, it was the regionalization of the Mughal Empire, its spirit, culture, and methods of administration. All these regional kingdoms governed in Mughal fashion, from taxation and court culture to patronage and how you raised armies. But before we go into more general trends, let's talk about some of the specific regional kingdoms that emerged in the mid-1700s. First, if we look to the south, there was the Kingdom of Hyderabad. Appointed as governors of this newly conquered province, its leader, called the Nizam, enjoyed virtual independence by the 1740s. He employed French mercenaries who lent new European military techniques and technology, such as a well-drilled infantry formations backed by rapid-firing guns. Hyderabad also stood on some of the world's only active diamond mines. Proceeding to the northeast, we come to Bengal. The governor of Bengal, Nawab Ali Vardi Khan, turned the province into a virtually independent kingdom after the 1740s. Bengal was also one of the most commercially active provinces in all of India. Its upcountry river systems served as an entry point for trade into India and the interior. And this is later where the British would establish their bridgehead into India. If we now move upcountry from Bengal, we find the Kingdom of Awadh. After the 1730s, Persian-born Shia rulers, or Nawabs, acknowledged the lordship of the Mughal emperor. But by the 1740s, they basically ran their own kingdom. In fact, historians have demonstrated that Awadh possessed one of the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus of any regional state, and that its penetration of the lush Gangetic countryside through taxation might have been more intense than any other Indian kingdom. Cutting across the central Indian plains westward, we find the Maratha Confederacy. Based out of the dry western lands and extending into central India, it was an efficient, bureaucratic, Brahmin-led kingdom. High-caste Brahmins dominated the ministries and styled themselves as an almost neo-Hindu kingdom, where Brahmins were the primary administrators. They splashed patronage upon Hindu religious endowments and, crucially, the pilgrimage city of Benares. Though they were a confederation of what some have called peasant warriors, their revenue-generating capacities and administration and management were some of the most advanced in 18th century India. Taxes were light on the peasantry, but collections and governance were fairly efficient. Moving north from Bombay to the northwest, we find the Punjab. This Sikh warrior state emerged in the latter half of the 18th century and pioneered military tactics with the help of European advisors. 12 Sikh confederacies bound together to establish a Sikh-ruled empire across most of the Punjab, even into modern-day Afghanistan. Its power culminated in 1800 under Ranjit Singh, who maintained efficient revenue and military systems and was able to keep Afghan and Uzbek raiders from the northwest at bay. In fact, Punjab probably had one of the most fearsome armies in South Asia by the end of the 18th century. Going to the far southwestern tip of India, we get to Mysore. Mysore was a compact kingdom which had an efficient bureaucratic administration. Charles Cornwallis described it as a, quote, perfect garden from one end to the other. It was led by Hyder Ali, who had built up an impressive military force, which was actually less dependent upon European mercenaries and Hindu bankers. In fact, it was this kingdom that would nearly boot the British out of South India in the 1770s. Now, all of these kingdoms had started to become much more aggressive in their taxation in the 18th century. And this was transpiring for a number of reasons. For one, warfare opened up new sources of opportunity for these revenue-hungry regional states. They fought each other. Local chiefs and governors saw opportunities for advancing their own influence and legitimacy. And this created a trend of what historians of India have called military fiscalism. Regional states such as Awadh, Bengal, Punjab, and Mysore were all devoting more shares of their expenditure to their armies. This meant there was a huge mercenary market in India. Even Englishmen, Frenchmen, and Germans were recruited into some of these armies. So, how did they get this extra revenue? Did they tax at higher rates? Did they find new sources of revenue? Well, in fact, it was a combination of a number of things. For one, the warfare and the regionalization of the Mughal Empire led regional states to extend agricultural cultivation. It could be taxed. They cleared jungle tracts, which not only created new farming lands, but also denied cover to enemy forces. Moreover, it led to an explosion of paper and bureaucratic management of agrarian taxes. Awadh, the Bengal, and the Maratha Confederacy all had extensive, sophisticated bureaucracies. In fact, India in the 18th century was likely one of the most paper-ridden places in the world. Land was valuable, and everyone, from kings to cultivators, wanted to document what was their rightful share. This meant that scribal abilities and those who were masters of such were at a premium. It was a good time to be a paper pusher. When territories were conquered and needed to be administered, and most importantly taxed, it was often Hindu pensmen who were vaulted into new positions of power, and they became indispensable for regional kings, whether they were Sikh, Muslim, or Hindu. And topping this all off was the decline of the Mughal court's authority. The process of regionalization was exacerbated further by a succession of poor, inattentive emperors after Aurangzeb. They rarely left the court, and lacked the qualities of their predecessors, such as Akbar. In fact, when told that the ruthless Afghan warrior Nadir Shah was planning to sack Delhi in 1739, the Mughal emperor at the time reportedly said in Persian, "Dili dur ast," or Delhi's far away from the northwest. So, if we step back for a moment, we can see that Mughal expansion created the preconditions for its own demise. Okay, we've covered a great deal today. Let's recap what we've discussed. We've looked at the Mughal Empire and how it was conquered, administered, and managed. We saw how the Mughals introduced a more regular system of governance and imperial management. And by 1700, Mughal India possessed wealth, glory, and splendor probably unmatched by any empire on earth. Yet at the same time, that wealth and expansion had come at a real cost. For one, the expansions and military campaigns of Aurangzeb had fiscally taxed the Mughal system. The regionalization of the empire, particularly in Awadh, Bengal, Punjab, and Hyderabad, meant that while the spirit of the Mughals' ruling traditions remained, local rulers were quietly subverting the larger system from within. Having been away from the Delhi court for so long, factions emerged in Aurangzeb's absence. This made central governance difficult when Aurangzeb died in 1707. As a result of Mughal expansionism, regional powers emerged in crucial areas such as Bengal, Awadh, Punjab, and Hyderabad. After the 1730s, they started consolidating their domains, ratcheting up taxation, raising revenue, larger armies, and building up what we would call the lock, stock, and smoking barrel of administration. They continued to rule, no doubt, in the emperor's name, and paid official homage to the emperor at the Delhi court. But in practice, these regional kingdoms operated independently and often ignored a distracted, weakened imperial center from Delhi. So it's in this context that we should really see the emergence of the English East India Company. The regionalization of the Mughal Empire created crucial dynamics for the emergence of British rule later on. The British stepped into a political landscape which valued commercial gain, military glory, and, increasingly, taxation and expansion. As we'll see, when the British came to power in Bengal during the 1750s, they didn't necessarily do things differently than what Indians were doing. They simply did them better.